I had the absolute pleasure of interviewing Meena Kandasamy, an East London based sociologist, poet, translator, and novelist whose writing portrays and embodies the Indian subcontinent's many struggles for social justice. In addition to being a poet, she has written critically acclaimed novels. Her first novel, or anti novel, The Gypsy Goddess, smudged the line between powerful fiction and fearsome critique in narrating the massacre of 44 untouchable men, women, and children in 1968 in Tamil Nadu. Her second novel, The Searing When I Hit You, the portrait of a writer as a young wife, drew upon her own experience in an abusive marriage to lift the veil of silence that surrounds domestic violence and marital rape in India. It was selected as the Book of the Year by The Guardian, The Observer, The Daily Telegraph, and Financial Times, and it was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2018. Her third novel came out just last year. It's called Exquisite Cadavers, and it's an exquisite work of experimental fiction which explores intimacy and racism in modern day England. Our conversation follows, and I really hope you enjoy it. In your first book, The Gypsy Goddess, you took a very strong stance in favor of experimentation. And the book basically said, experimentation is essential to dissident literature because readers can always go find an academic article or journal article on injustice, but they won't. And that's why we need to be writing in ways which tear apart traditional techniques. So, what do you make of all this? How has your thinking over the years changed on the relationship between, revolutionary content and experimental form? Like, do they two always have to go together? Do they need each other?
When you're a writer from the margins, you really have the additional burden of having to theorize yourself, of having to justify where you're, because nobody else is doing this kind of writing. Nobody else is writing peasant militant strikes that deal with also caste struggle, caste supremacy, class struggle, women dying, police atrocity, all of this kind of very particular specific things in the English novel that comes out of India. So you're also theorizing for yourself, which means that there is a certain author inflicting themselves, and at the same time this hyper awareness. I think what people call play is also a certain hyper awareness, a certain idea of not only dismantling things but being conscious that you're dismantling, and taking a certain pleasure out of it, or at least watching this dismantling process. I think that's where I think the element of play comes in. And critics who even love your book, in terms of political content, always expect that just because you happen to write a Marxist text, it has to be very simple, accessible, which the book is, but also very straightforward. And there is a certain pushback against it, which is kind of what I think Exquisite Cadavers reflects in it. Like, why are you playing with form when the world is burning? But I think some of the reasons why, in a larger sense, the world is burning is because we have taken structures for granted. We assume this is how things have to be. We assume that capitalists have to do what they're doing. We assume that we are there to be, everybody has to find a job, everybody has to work in a job. We assume that some people are going to be rich. We assume that, some of us are born poor, we have to stay this way. So I think that, in that just accepting everything is what's led us to this. So in a sense, for me, it's also rebelling against this kind of passive acceptance. So it's a question of about not just being people to whom things have been done, but to show that we are people who are doing things. Therefore, I'm an intellectual. I think. I'm a writer. I create. I'm an artist, so I imagine. So to lay claim to these spaces which are denied to you. So I'm not just the person who has suffered, and this is not a suffering diary, so to say. So
That's something that you had to deal with a lot with your second book, which kept being called a memoir and read as a memoir. So what was the responses when people were told basically it's a novel? What was at stake for them in it being a memoir? Like, how did they insist, or what did you learn from that?
I think it's quite an interesting question because there's always a very vulgar curiosity about a women's writer's life, irrespective whether it's a fiction, non-fiction, memoir, whatever genre you're working on. So when I was writing poetry, the charge is always that you're writing poetry for easy popularity, you're writing poetry to create controversy, you're writing about sex so that people look at you. So I think as a woman, you're really you're so exposed to, what people would say. And therefore, like, when you write something and yeah, you call it a novel, of course you've written one. I had already written a novel. I know what a novel does, I know what a memoir does. And so the insistence that this was, just my life, also was in many ways, it's not just, on one aspect. And this is something that I largely deal with it in terms of literature, in terms of all the interviews I've given. And yeah, even with Exquisite Cadavers, which is to say that, it is out of fiction. It's, in many parts based on, yeah, what I experienced in that marriage. But a lot of it is also imagined. So, a lot of the parents, a lot of the lovers, a lot of, the storytelling, all of this is, of course. But it's not for me to say to you, okay, this portion of the book is imagined, this portion is real. It's not like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to have to subject myself to that. But the question was also, in trying to not even let me decide what genre the book belongs to. I feel like a certain sense of violation, like people telling you what you are doing, like it's a kind of mansplaining, but on such a massive level. Like, people actually tell you what book you wrote, and that's very that's very disturbing, I think.
And then the next book was very much a pushback. I mean, I think part of the reason you write in the book, part of the reason you adopted this kind of marginalia format for it was because you wanted to just very clearly show that you are able to invent and you are able to write a novel and you're not just writing a diary.
Yeah,
What
and
has
as well as to show that one doesn't necessarily have to write out of personal experience. So that's another thing. For instance, the first novel is about 1968, a massacre that takes place on landless agricultural laborers. I've never been a landless agricultural laborer myself. My father's parents might have been, my father himself might have been, but yeah, unfortunately, I didn't have to face that. But the idea is that you write only out of your life experiences becomes like a cross to bear, or it's not, or it's read like that. So for me to create a character who's, involved very much in the Tunisian Arab Spring, or and as a filmmaker, very different, very worlds removed from what I do with my life. I think that was really empowering and liberating. And at the same time, yeah, the question of, addressing or yeah, saying, even laying claim to saying, oh, I'm a thinking person, or I'm a creator. I think that becomes important. And the other thing that I keep thinking in terms of creation is also, I think there's also the other element of, politics in all of this, because all of this work does come out of some kind of political engagement, which is why, yeah, I think that sometimes you have to take this kind of thing seriously, because does it matter if people think this is a memoir? Does it actually matter if people think it's a novel? In terms of, I'm not the type of person who's going to correct, I don't know, some women who is reading this book in Indore or in Bhubaneswar, and really reading is as a memoir and feeling good or bad about it. I'm not going to go and lay claim to this, anonymous wife who herself may be suffering domestic violence and tell her, no, this is how you read my book. For me, they can think exactly everything happened to me, or they can think it's a diary. I'm not claiming literary merit from them. I think this is also about my own conversation with the establishment. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The idea of how I'm received. And I think, yeah, it is my duty to intercede, because if I don't speak for myself, who will?
So do you think in future work you are much more unmoored now? You can write, be anyone, write anything?
That is true, but also I think that, at least for me, um, I think for me, India is like this abiding larger, bigger concern to write about. So because a lot of stories that concern India have to be told. and and sometimes and one of those things is also about the Exquisite Cadavers as well. The other story was that, how could you tell the story, for instance, of Bhima Koregaon? So on the one hand, this is happening and is, reflected in a different sense in terms of what happens in prisons in Tunisia, or it happens in, the military state or deep state apparatus of Tunisia, and how an artist is, supposed to relate to that. So Karim's brother is arrested and he has to go. But for me, the idea is also that how do you write fiction as it keeps happening in contemporary society? So for instance, when I started writing this book, and it's dedicated to the people who are arrested under the Bhima Koregaon case, the book is already out for like a year and a half, and the case trial has still not started. So we cannot even tell the story because the full story we don't know. So there is a way in which we can only say fragments and snippets of the story and allow other stories to fill this place, or we can imagine or foresee or kind of anticipate what will come out of it. So I think we are also in that kind of a certain deadlock, because no one knows how this case is going to go. For instance, one of the people in jail is an 80-year-old poet, like, and I stay awake at night thinking, what if he dies in jail? Like, it's going to be all our blood on his blood on all our hands, isn't it? Like, we couldn't get him out. And yeah, this is like one of the most revolutionary poets in our country, like just going into jail on a false charge, dying during a pandemic. And I think we all have like, and that's something like, if I had to not write about Bhima Koregaon that way, I would have to just wait for that story. But when do we tell this story? So, on how many stories are told? So, I think that we also have to. I don't know, how do we write fiction under fascism? I think this is a very interesting question. If we are writers, and we have to, all of us have to think through these kind of questions, isn't it? So, how do we write about repression as it is ongoing? How do we write about the control of women as it is ongoing? How do we write about riots? They are ongoing. So I think, yeah, this is a question I'm really, do we go back to poetry, just so that it can capture a moment and an essence, or do we look for larger stories? I think these are questions I just keep asking myself. So yeah.
So what is just for our project, what we're thinking about and would like to have your help and guidance thinking about is, what is avant-garde for us right now? Like, what does that mean? Is that laying claim to some intellectual tradition, going back to Europe at some point and going back to all over the world at that same point, or is it a certain kind of throwing the rules out experimentation which has value in and of itself? I mean, what is avant-garde? What's its relationship to all these experimentalism and politics?
I think for every person it has a different connotation. So as I was telling to you, um, uh, the last novel, for instance, the title "Exquisite Cadavers" does come from exquisite corpses. So this sorry, a game of saying play word play, and a kind of game of consequences where each person kind of adds to the story or adds to a sentence and you form a composite. But it's also something that comes from art. So there are three people can draw and create a hybrid animal or monster or whatever you decide to draw. And but it's very interesting because all of this, whether Andre Breton was doing it or all the others with him, they were doing this under fascism, just before they were going to escape to Mexico. And so there's a certain overpowering influence, and this totalitarian power that's going to come to get you, and then you turn actually to the most absurd forms of storytelling or play. And these are really, really interlinked, because how do you laugh at untrammeled power? Either you're completely terrorized by it, or you completely delegitimize its authority by laughing in its face or doing the most absurd things. So I think these are kind of connected. So for me, there is obviously that aspect of play that informs the work, but there's also uh, again the question of fascism means the question of and I view Hindu Brahmin fascism as a broader fascism. Of course there's a caste aspect of it, of course there's a huge patriarchal aspect of it, but overarchingly you still have to understand that this is a denial of democracy, this is a denial of women's rights, this is a denial of workers' rights, and it is going back into very solidified caste formations. And when you go into this, how does your writing start reflecting the fight against fascism, or how is your writing anti-fascist? In the sense, you go back to people's stories. You go back to, at least for me, fiction has to capture the anger of people. It has to capture their successful resilience. It has to capture, all these little wins. So I think for me, I cannot be done in a very bourgeois individual form of the novel, in which there are, I don't know, like a lot of upper class or middle class Indian fiction is, which I'm not going to name and drag anybody into a controversy, but it's just not for me. So yeah, I have to create a fictional world where this world can be accommodated, and I think that's what I've tried to do with all the 3 books that I've written. So to find a language, to find a universe, to just hold all of this together, and of course experiment, because once again, I come from a certain background of linguistics. So for me, language is something I'm really raw to and exposed to. So I find that, yeah, as I was telling earlier, all these things about little registers and what they mean, and how does power show itself through language, but also who is allowed to speak, who is not allowed to speak. So yeah, for me, I think that's an abiding concern when I write. So and also it's quite an interesting place uh, in terms of intellectual traditions as well, isn't it? So novel is a long tradition in Europe, and so for somebody breaking a rule there might just be, might not necessarily have to come from a political place. Whereas I think, even the history of female literacy in a country like India is like, imagine at the turn of like the 19th century, 20th century, how many percentage of women were just literate. Like my grandmothers were like using the thumbprint, and it's like my own grandmothers. So what does it mean for a woman to write? What does it mean for somebody to say their stories? And I think that, yeah, so yeah, even women writing in that sense, in and of itself, coming from a culture where they were not, given access to the spoken word, or coming from a culture where education and women were seen as completely opposed and antithetical to each other, I think anything that women would have said would be like a radical. And for me, that's where I would define all of these as what I would call, I think there's an element of postmodernism about my own engagement with literature. So yeah, all of this for me would be avant-garde, like just not the old, for me it would be just the new, I think so.
I think that's all the time of yours we'll take today. So thank you so much for talking to us and being with us. It's been lovely to have you.